Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all of you. So nice to have a great big group for our author series presentation today. I'm Tracy Stewart, your host, and our presenter today will be Sean Salai SJ, author of What Would Pope Francis Do? Just a couple of tips before I hand over to our presenter. For those of you who aren't familiar with GoToWebinar, on the right-hand side of your screen, there'll be a control panel similar to this one. And if you don't see it, just look for the little red box with the white arrow and click there. Your audio choices are here, and most importantly, your questions box, because we'll have a question and answer session after Sean speaks today. So type your questions in there, and then remember to hit send, and we will get to just as many of those as we possibly can. I know Sean will be happy to hear from you. And we are going to have a little giveaway this afternoon. What would Pope Francis do? Books. We're going to give away several of them. So if you're on the webinar after a question and answer session, I will announce the people just drawn at random who will receive a copy. For those of you who didn't win, of course, you can always get a copy at www.osv.com. And I think you're going to want one so you can delve deeper into this and read more of Sean's story. So make sure you stay online and you can give me your address if you win. You must be present to win. And now our presenter. It's with great pleasure I introduce you to our speaker, Sean Salai SJ. Sean is a Jesuit and contributing writer at American Magazine. He holds an MA in Applied Philosophy from Loyola University at Chicago and a BA in History from Wabash College, which he attended on a scholarship from the Indianapolis Star newspaper. Before entering the Society of Jesus in 2005, he was a Metro desk newspaper reporter for the Washington Times and the Boca Raton News, where his articles were picked up by the Drudge Report and other national media outlets. He taught theology and coached forensics at Jesuit High School of Tampa in 2010 to 2014. Sean's freelance writing has appeared in America, National Catholic Reporter, Catholic World Report, Busted Halo, Crisis Magazine, Civil War Book Review, and other publications. He's also a contributing editor of American Conservatism and Encyclopedia and Choosing the Right College, two reference works from the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. And his academic writing has appeared in 3 publications, including the Haythrop Journal. Sean, I am going to unmute you and say hello. How are you?
Wonderful. Good morning.
Good morning.
Or afternoon, depending where you are.
It's afternoon where I am, but some of our people on the West Coast, it would still be morning. So I'm going to make you presenter, and you'll see that little box up here on your screen. You just click yes for that.
Okay.
And I can see your screen there.
Okay. Wonderful.
And I'll hand over.
Great. Well, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I'll hand over to you and see you at the question and answer break.
Wonderful. Well, good morning, everybody. It's 9 a.m. here on the West Coast. And as Tracy said, my name is Sean Salai SJ. I'm a Jesuit, and I'm in my 11th year of training to be a Jesuit priest. So I started my training in 2005, and I'm petitioning for ordination to the diaconate in October and to the priesthood next June. And I'm currently studying for my MDiv at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University in Berkeley, California. I grew up in Indiana, went to Wabash College, went to a public high school. Our mascot was the Red Devils. And it's wonderful to join you all to talk about my new book, What Would Pope Francis Do? Bringing the good news to people in need. And I'm going to just kind of walk through the book chapter by chapter, tell a little bit about the book, a little bit about the stories in the book, and then open it up for questions. So about the book, the basic question of the book is how can we as ordinary Christians answer the call of the Pope to go out to the margins, to go out to the peripheries as a field hospital church. One thing that people have been moved by with this Pope is his real focus on people in need, people who are maybe on the outskirts of the church, outskirts of society, people who may feel distant to God, and his desire to reach out to them with mercy especially in this year of mercy. The book offers stories of ordinary people and saints who have tried to live out this call in their lives. So the basic idea of the book is that God first loved us so that we can love others. And once we really experience the love of God, once we really feel the love of God on a deeply interior level, we feel motivated to go out and love others in return. And so this book is kind of looking at our response to God's love. How is it that we sort of discern God's call in our lives, God's voice, and see what is it that we can do to go out to the margins ourselves. And as a fellow Jesuit, I kind of get Pope Francis. I understand his perspective. I know where he's coming from. You know, when I was teaching high school, I was Mr. Salai. When he was teaching high school, he was Mr. Bergoglio as part of his Jesuit training when he taught high school chemistry. So I weave a lot of stories about my own Jesuit life into the book, stories about Pope Francis, stories about various Jesuit saints and Jesuit devotions that are important to Francis, and also stories about people he's interacted with, stories about ordinary Christians and Catholics today who are trying to basically walk in the path of Jesus, which can be very difficult in our day, especially with this election season going on, when a lot of us are tempted to anger, tempted to despair. A lot of us feel sort of hopeless sometimes in the face of all the difficult things going on in the world. But the message of Francis and the joy of the gospel is that if we stay rooted in Jesus Christ at the center of our prayer, at the center of our lives, that gives us a secure anchor of peace and faith and harmony that we can sort of take with us. The chapters of the book follow 6 themes from Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, which is the Pope's apostolic exhortation from late 2013. The table of the contents of the book look like this. There's an introduction on joy, and then these 6 themes from Evangelii Gaudium are longing, closeness, dignity, weariness, tenderness, Mary, and finally I have a conclusion on courage, sort of a takeaway chapter in the book looking at what we can do from here. So I'm going to go through these one at a time. In the introduction to the book, Joy, I talk about the outline of the book, how through 6 themes in his exhortation, this Pope invites us to join him on the mission of bringing the good news of Jesus to the needy. And I talk about how this is a call to all of us, not just for priests and bishops and clergy, but that all of us, no matter what our state of life or age or limitations, can do something to participate in this mission, whether it's reaching out to a neighbor, praying in our own home, helping out with the social ministry or soup kitchen or Vincent de Paul Center at our parish. I start the introduction with a story. I've got this quote on the slide: what if the next Pope is a Jesuit? And this is a question that was asked to me in February of 2013. Pope Benedict XVI had retired, and I was teaching freshman boys at Jesuit High School in Tampa, Florida, about how a new pope is elected, talking about the white smoke, talking about the black smoke, and sort of walking them through the conclave process. And one of the boys, his hand shot up and he said, "Mr. Salai, what if the next pope is a Jesuit?" And I said, that's not going to happen. That's never happened before. There's never been a Jesuit pope. Jesuits take a vow to avoid honors in the Catholic Church, and it's just something that just seems out of possibility. But the student kept persisting, and he said, well, who are the Jesuit cardinals? I just want to know. And so on the overhead projector in the classroom, I pulled up a biography from the Vatican website of Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio. And I showed it to my classes, and I said, this is the only Jesuit in the conclave. He's the only Jesuit cardinal, the only Jesuit candidate for pope. He's not going to be pope. I can tell you that as a fellow Jesuit. And I'll show this to you, but don't make too much out of this. And for 5 class periods, I told my students this same thing, 150 students, and then a week or 2 later, Pope Francis walked out on the balcony, and it was Cardinal Bergoglio. And 25 heads in my classroom swiveled to the side and looked at me in shock. And they said, "You were wrong, Mr. Salai." And I said, "Yep, I was wrong." And I've never been so happy to be wrong. It was an amazing experience to be in a Jesuit high school when a Jesuit was elected Pope for the first time, somebody from the Americas, someone from Latin America. And the atmosphere was electric. The chapel bells on the campus started ringing. The boys started screaming and shouting and jumping up and down. We had a couple of local TV news crews from our ABC and CBS affiliates in the classroom buildings to film our reaction. They didn't know it was going to be a Jesuit Pope, but they were quite happy with what they captured on film. And so one thing I say in this introduction is that anything is possible with God, even a Jesuit Pope. Chapter 1 talks about longing, this idea that all of us long for God. It's something that we aren't always able to articulate, but we all sort of want to be close to God. We all want to be embraced by God. We're made to be in relationship with God. And I start this chapter out by talking about my trip to World Youth Day in Brazil in summer of 2013 with 40 Jesuit high school students, 5 Jesuits, some college students who had graduated from the high school, and this experience we had of going to sleep on Copacabana Beach in Rio de Janeiro and waking up with 3 million people to celebrate Mass with the Pope. And it was just an awesome experience. And we were tested in a lot of ways, physically, emotionally, spiritually, as we spent a week in Paraguay touring Jesuit mission sites before World Youth Day, going to see the Iguazu Falls and Guarani Indian villages and things depicted in the movie The Mission. We were tested in Rio when we got to Rio for a week of World Youth Day, when our bus sort of had some issues and we couldn't stay at the nice parish where they had slotted us to stay. And the city was just overwhelmed by the number of people that turned out to see Pope Francis, and this great longing that everyone had to just be close to God, to somehow be close to Christ through the person of the Pope. We ended up sleeping in a favela in a slum in an elementary school with bars on the window where we heard sirens at night, and not too far away from where Pope Francis one day visited one of the slums in Rio. And as we went by on the train one day, which was always overcrowded and breaking down, we saw the Pope's entourage outside of our train window nearby where we were staying. So this idea of longing is that all of us long to be for God, but God longs to be for us. God longs to be with us. And so we start with this longing of God for us and this love of God for us. And this love that isn't a love that comes out of fear. It isn't a love that comes out of a desire for reward, but it's a love of the person for the person's sake. I love you because you are you. And this is the kind of love that God shows to us. In chapter 2, I talk about closeness, how as we grow in the love of God and feel moved to go out of ourselves, out of our comfort zones, we feel drawn close to people's lives. We enter fully into the messiness of people's lives, the complications of society. I start out with a story about Pope Francis, the custom that many of us know. During the Easter Triduum, he likes to visit a Roman prison to celebrate Holy Thursday Mass. And so on Holy Thursday this year, as he's done in each year of his papacy, he went to Rebibbia prison and he washed the feet of several inmates at the prison, women, men, Muslims, Catholics, all sorts of people. And this is the same prison where Pope John Paul II visited to pray with his assassin, would-be assassin, Mehmed Ali Akça, in the early 1980s. So it's a very symbolic place of forgiveness and healing. And I myself work in San Quentin State Prison on Sundays in the Catholic chaplaincy, where I attend Mass and I go and do cell visits and pastoral conversations with different inmates. And it's a very powerful thing to be in a prison and be with people who are isolated from society, who are locked up and can't go anywhere, who feel so distant in some ways from God's love. And to be able to bring comfort to them is a difficult but beautiful experience. And Pope Francis certainly does that when he goes to this prison each year. Chapter 3 on dignity. Every person, regardless of worldly accomplishments, is worthy of our giving. The idea that God's love applies to all of us, rich or poor, healthy or ill, young or old. I start out with this line in the chapter: Ashley sat on the sidewalk outside of Starbucks every afternoon with a cardboard sign begging for money. And I tell the story of this young homeless woman named Ashley, who I was working with in the summer of 2014 while I was working at America Magazine, the publication in New York City and Manhattan, for which I serve as contributing writer. And I was doing a summer stint working in our office there in Manhattan. And Manhattan is full of homeless people. You have people who come from around the country to Manhattan because there's a lot of tourists and they can get big money from the tourists there. And it's a place that if you're homeless, you know that you can make some money. And one of the issues there is drug addiction. You know, people feed drug habits, all sorts of emotional issues. This particular woman was in her 20s, so she wasn't quite at the point where she had completely fallen into the lifestyle. And I was trying to offer some kind of lifeline to her and to other homeless folks that I ran into on the streets, because as I walked from our office on Fifth Avenue, as I walked from our office to St. Patrick's Cathedral each day, or to coffee shops and various places in Manhattan, I felt like I couldn't walk past all of these homeless people without engaging them. So I would talk to them, I would bring food in my bags for them, and just try to spend time with them and get to know them, look them in the eye. And Pope Francis really calls us to this, to not just walk past the people we ignore every day, but to treat them as people and to look them in the eyes and to get to know their name, get to know their story. When Pope Francis was Archbishop of Buenos Aires in Argentina, he was friends with the homeless outside his cathedral. And there was one woman in particular that he greeted and talked with every day as he went into the cathedral. And when he was elected Pope, she missed him very much because she considered him to be her friend. And so Francis says all of us can be friends with the homeless, the elderly, the marginalized, and that in doing so we find something of our own dignity. We find something of God in that. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4 on weariness. When we go to the margins, we have to be honest about how it affects us. And a lot of us who work in the church, whether it's as clergy or vowed religious like myself, or even as a lay person teaching in a Catholic school, working as a social worker, doing various works with people on the margins, even working with people in our own families who may be struggling from various issues of addiction. It's going to wear us out, you know, and there's always the danger of stress and burnout. And so they talk about compassion fatigue. And so in this chapter, I kind of look at Francis's words in the book, or in the exhortation, about how do we transform our fatigue into an ever-deepening outreach? How do we take that and transform it into something that is energizing and compassionate? And part of it is self-care, taking care of ourselves and not trying to save the world, but really being humble enough to say that it's God who saves people and not us, so that we are not God, but God is there. And when we're working with people, we don't try to make ourselves into the Savior, but we do it in a humble way that we try to invite God into the space of people's lives, or invite people to look at God's presence in a different way when we see God present with someone, but it may be difficult for that person to see it. So I start the chapter, ugh, another 12-hour workday is staring me in the face. And I talk about teaching high school for 4 years in Tampa, Florida, where I would get up at 6:30 or 7 in the morning and go to a prayer service at 8, teach classes all day, grade in my classroom, go home and fall asleep from fatigue praying in my easy chair, go to evening prayer, dinner with my Jesuit community, attend school events all night, get up at 6 in the morning to drive the forensics or high school debate team to tournaments. And when you're spending so much time caring for others, you have to be very careful to care for yourself as well, and to realize that you're only human and that you need God to care for you as well. So it's a wonderful thing, but it's exhausting. You know, anytime we respond to God's love and try to love others, we really need to remember that it's God's love acting through us, at the best times. In Chapter 5 on tenderness, I talk about this notion of interacting with people in a way that's very intimate. And Francis uses this word tenderness a lot. He talks about how it characterizes his interactions with others and about how it might characterize ours. The chapter starts, I asked the middle-aged man across from me who was the last good American president. And I tell a little story about Christopher Hitchens, the late atheist writer, who I got to know a little bit when I was a student at Wabash College and hosted a debate on the legacy of Ronald Reagan between Christopher Hitchens and Dinesh D'Souza, a conservative Catholic writer. And I was able to spend some time with Hitchens, just the two of us, and I got to talk to him a little bit. And I found that he was a very sort of compassionate person in his own way, despite a lot of the struggles and the difficulties of his life and the sufferings of him dying from cancer. And despite his great atheism and sort of virulent attitude towards God, I actually kind of liked the man. And so I talk a little bit in this chapter about how, you know, God is in everybody's life, even if the person isn't aware of it. And even with someone like Christopher Hitchens, we're called to be in relationship with people who aren't Catholic, people who aren't in the church, and maybe people in our own families who have fallen away from their faith or are struggling in some way. That Francis says we don't need to just stay in our pews and pray, but we can go out to those people and interact in a way that is caring and loving. Chapter 6 talks about Mary, the mother of evangelization, as Pope Francis calls her in Evangelii Gaudium, and she remains an ever-present model of Christian discipleship. So in a lot of ways, this last chapter in the book ties up all the themes of the book in Mary. So Mary is also the way the Pope ties up his exhortation. She was nobody, a struggling illiterate girl from a poor town in the middle of nowhere. I start out by telling the story of Mary just through ordinary human eyes. Sometimes as Catholics, with our wonderful dogmas and teachings about Mary, we may lose sight about her human dimensions. And what she went through is basically an unwed pregnant teenager who was struggling with a very difficult thing, and somehow God entered into the messiness of her life. The themes of longing, closeness, dignity, weariness, and tenderness we can see in the life of Mary as she struggled to carry out God's mission and really trusted and surrendered to God in her life. And this is something that really touches a lot of people very deeply, the maternal love of Mary, in a way kind of mirrors for us the maternal love of God for all of us, because we know that God is a father, but we know that God also loves us in a motherly way or in a tender way. And so one of the devotions of Pope Francis is Mary, Undoer of Knots, which is a German devotion he discovered when he was studying theology for a possible doctorate in Germany in the 80s. And the image of Mary, Undoer of Knots is very simple and beautiful. It's the idea that when our life gets all knotted up and tangled, we can turn to Mary and hand her the rope. And she can sit there and patiently unknot the rope with us in a very, very loving way. So the conclusion of the book is called Courage. And I start out, it wasn't supposed to end this way. And in this book, I sort of weave the story of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuit founder, with the story of Pope Francis. And there are lots of similarities. For every Jesuit, we all have one experience in common, which is we don't get what we want all the time. The Jesuit vow is a vow of obedience. The idea is that we go where the needs are the greatest. We go where the mission takes us. We're missionaries. And St. Ignatius was a soldier in his young life, and at age 30, he kind of got hit by a cannonball and reconsidered his life and thought about where his life was heading. And then God led him on a very different path that ultimately resulted in him founding the Jesuit order. And when Ignatius had his conversion experience, recovering from his wounds, he wanted to go to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem. And because of hostilities and wars with the Muslim Turks who ran the Holy Land and the Christians there, he wasn't able to stay in Jerusalem. So plan B, he came back to Europe and he founded the Jesuit order. And even then, he wanted to be a missionary. He wanted to spend his life evangelizing in the Middle East among the Turks. And he wanted to sort of convert the whole world to the love of Christ. He ended up getting elected Father General of the Jesuit order, writing the constitutions of the order, and spending the last years of his life in a desk job in Rome, sort of sending his men out, writing letters, buying real estate, starting schools. And in a lot of ways, that was for him the negation of his dream, of his ideal to be this sort of traveling missionary. And he had to live vicariously through all of his Jesuit sons. In the Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius, which is the retreat manual for a silent retreat that all Jesuits make in a 30-day silent form twice in our lives and in an 8-day silent form each year, there's 3 questions in this meditation. And the meditation is to look at Jesus on the cross and to consider all that he's done for us as he's on the cross, looking at us with love, and to ask ourselves, what have we done for Christ? What are we doing for Christ? And what will we do for Christ? And so I end the book with these sort of reflections and basically also ask, what would Pope Francis do? You know, we don't live in the time of St. Ignatius. We don't live in the 16th century, but we live in the 21st century. And if we're going to be disciples of Christ with our eyes wide open to the world around us, we have to be concerned with things like the migrant crisis, with the plight of refugees and the homeless and the poor, the plight of the elderly in our midst. Pope Francis has this great tender love for Pope Benedict, who's now retired in the Vatican, and sort of shows us a way to treat the elderly with respect. So that's the book in a nutshell, and I'm really grateful to introduce it briefly today, and I believe we have some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. I do have several questions. First one, how do you think the political situation in Argentina impacted Pope Francis's view of the poor and how we should serve them?
Well, thank you for that question. I had the privilege of interviewing Austin Ivory for America Magazine a few months ago, and Austin is a British journalist who wrote a book on Pope Francis, sort of considered the definitive biography on Francis. And Austin did his doctoral studies on Argentinian politics in the 60s. And one thing that he's very keen on is understanding Francis through the context of someone who grew up under the regime of Juan and Eva Perón, what they call Peronism, sort of the ruling party in Argentina. And it's kind of this sort of populism which, in the one hand, appeals to the instincts of the people and sort of appeals to concern for the poor, but it also results in this oligarchy where in Argentina you have people who are outwardly progressive and liberal in their policies towards the poor, but live in a very ostentatious way. And so you have this sort of populist ruling party that sort of appeals to the legacy of Juan Perón and to care for the poor, and at the same time dresses in a very gaudy way and sort of flaunts wealth in front of people. And this is a problem for Francis because at the same time this is happening, Buenos Aires is full of all these serious problems of addiction and drugs and prostitution and child slavery. And all of this kind of coexists with this political party which sort of exalts the poor. The other thing, of course, is in the 70s during some of the wars and sort of the more right-wing regime that Francis was involved in the so-called Dirty War. And so he had some personal experiences. I mentioned one in the book where he saved a fellow named Gonzalo by taking this fellow to a seminary on the outskirts of the city and telling him, if we're stopped by the police, tell them you're on the way to make a retreat, because Francis was trying to get these Catholics and these Jesuit priests out of harm's way. And Francis was the provincial of Argentina at age 36 a very young age to be in charge of all the Jesuits in the country. And so he dealt with a lot of very personally anguishing decisions at that time. And so in a lot of ways, his life has been touched by suffering and sort of the compassion he has for people who are in impossible situations. And I believe we see that with the way he treats people today.
Thank you. The next question, if Pope Francis took a vow not to take a position of honor, how does he reconcile that?
That's a great question. And in the Jesuit order, you know, we kind of take this special fourth vow of obedience to the Pope when we make our final profession, our final vows after we're ordained priests. And one of the sort of fine print vows that we take is to refuse honors in the Catholic Church, which typically means for a Jesuit, I won't become a bishop, I won't become a Monsignor, and I won't become a Pope. But at the same time, we also believe that if the Church really calls us to this, we have to accept. And so Jesuits have served as bishops in various mission territories in various places around the world which are not glamorous, which a lot of people don't want. Our bishop here in Oakland, California is a Jesuit, Bishop Michael Barber. And Jesuits typically will give one answer when someone says, we want you to be a bishop. The Jesuit will say, I would like to avoid this. Can I please not do this? You know, Cardinal Dulles, a Jesuit at Fordham University who was a great theologian, when he became a cardinal, his compromise was to say to Pope John Paul II, make me a cardinal but not a bishop. So he was a priest and a cardinal, but he actually was not a bishop, which is a very rare thing. And with Pope Francis, when he was elected in the conclave as a Jesuit, he didn't seek that job. His resignation letter as a bishop was on the desk of Pope Benedict when the conclave started because he had aged out of the point where you had to retire. But he also saw it as the Church saying to him, we want you to do this. And as a good Jesuit, he just couldn't say no to that.
Okay. How could Mary have been illiterate if she lived and was taught in temple from age 3 until 16?
That's a great question. So, and I'm no scripture scholar, but one of the things we tend to forget about ancient times is that although people may not have been able to read and write, they were very literate in kind of an oral sense. And going to temple, they didn't have copies of Bibles in their hands. They didn't have copies of the Torah or the Old Testament, but they listened to it and they internalized it and they memorized it and they recited it. So in a sense, it's a different kind of literacy that we have in the ancient world where people are literate in the sense of knowing their faith, knowing their scriptures, but not necessarily being able to read and write that. And that's one of the reasons they had the system of scribes in the Jewish religion at the time of Jesus. And the scribes were specifically trained to be able to read and write and kind of fulfilled the function of lawyers in the Jewish religion.
Okay, thank you. The next question. I live in a very small town, and I have a hard time finding opportunities to give my children with the poor. There are no homeless out on the streets here. Do you have any ideas?
I'm not sure I understand the question. It was give my children with the poor?
It says we live in a very small town, and I have a hard time finding opportunities to give my children for my children with the poor. So the children.
For my children with the poor. Yeah, and that's a difficult thing is if you belong to a parish and they don't really have any sort of outreach to the poor. And, you know, in a sense, you can kind of find another way to be with the poor. And sometimes we idealize the poor and think the poor are somewhere else. But Blessed Mother Teresa, who I talk about in the book, she said the poor are among us. And so even if you live in a small town, one great way to be with the poor might be to go to a nursing home and just spend some time with the elderly folks in the nursing home playing bingo. One thing we do as Jesuits when we're starting out as novices is we go to nursing homes and spend time with people and just get to know them and be in relationship. And elderly folks, as Pope Francis is fond of saying, are often kind of discarded by society because they're at an age where they can't do as much as they used to. So in a sense, they are the poor among us. And that might be one way to do it, but I would just encourage the person who asked the question to kind of pray about that and maybe talk about it with other people to kind of come up with what she feels is the best way to get her children involved. And it might be that she herself might want to model that and go with her kids to do some of that. Because as a high school teacher, I know that kids really appreciate the example of their parents, and that really affects them more than they admit sometimes when they're teenagers.
Okay, next question, a couple of along these lines. Has Pope Francis been influenced by liberal theology? And right along the lines of that, can you talk about his recent meeting with Bernie Sanders?
Oh, well, I didn't know he had met with Bernie Sanders, so I apologize for not being able to respond to that. In terms of liberal theology, the only thing I can think of is what they call liberation theology. And this is often considered liberal or progressive, and it's specifically in the context of Latin America. And liberation theology was criticized by Pope St. John Paul II on a few scores. But at the same time, there are a lot of things that are valuable about liberation theology. And there are some liberation theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez, who's a Dominican in Latin America, who have never been in any sort of trouble with the Vatican. And something that I believe Pope Francis appreciates about liberation theology is the basic idea that not all suffering is something we should just accept. You know, that in our lives we accept suffering we can't prevent. So some suffering like cancer, some suffering like a natural disaster, that's something that's just part of reality. We can't do anything to stop it. We can't do anything to undo it. But there's other kinds of suffering which we shouldn't just say, well, you know, God made me suffer, so I should just accept that. And these are the kinds of suffering that we cause to each other. So things like the exploitation of the poor, unfair wages, the way the third world has been treated, the way Latin America has been treated by developed nations. And Francis kind of grew up in the midst of the effects of kind of this globalized system we have where some nations like ours in the United States, we live very wealthy and in a very privileged way compared to a lot of Latin America, which doesn't have drinkable water, doesn't have electricity. And it's a very sad thing. And sometimes in the United States, we just assume that the world around us in our little kind of enclave of the world is normal. But as a Jesuit, Francis has been around the world, and he's seen a lot of suffering in the world. And so I don't know in terms of liberal or conservative, I don't believe Francis operates in those categories. But I do think he appreciates liberation theology for its basic compassion to say, you know, the poor don't always have to just accept being poor as their fate from God, that some of this may be something worth knowing that God doesn't want you to be suffering in a certain way. And liberation theology obviously has its more militant excesses and Marxist excesses in the 80s when some priests in Latin America were joining armed rebellions. And that's problematic whenever a priest takes up a weapon and fights and, you know, is urging people to kill people and to resist people in a violent way. But I don't believe Francis really favors a violent solution. So thank you for that question.
Okay, I have one more question unless something comes in the next couple seconds. You have to take care of yourself. That was in quotes. That resonates with me as I see many of my friends who give so much to the church, the 20% who do 80% of the work. How can we best support them?
Okay, well that's a really, really good question. And it is kind of a reality in a lot of our institutions, a lot of our parishes, a lot of our campus ministries, a lot of our schools, that it seems to be the same small group of people who do everything. and everybody else is kind of content with that. And so you have people who are the ministers and the people who are the ministered to, and that's a real struggle for our church. One thing that I believe Francis is saying that you can do to help is take responsibility. Say to yourself, this isn't just something that my priest does, or the people who run my parish does, or the people who walk around with name tags and clipboards and distribute the Eucharist and read at Mass do. And it's not just something I'm watching as a passive participant, but this is my church too. And I'm called to get involved. I'm called to take ownership of it. And a lot of times Catholics, we tend to be complacent. We tend to be content to let other people be the kind of Catholics we don't have the discipline to be or don't have the time to be. And so I believe, and I think Francis believes this too, that the Catholic Church suffers from this kind of attitude that there's a chosen few who do everything and the rest of us kind of just sit back and watch it and sometimes complain about it. But Francis also reminds us that when we complain about the church, we're complaining about ourselves, because it's not an us and them situation, but we're all Catholics. We're all part of the church. We're all called by our baptism to be priests, prophets, and kings, to be self-giving leaders who lead by example as Jesus did, to be prophetic voices who speak out against injustice, who speak out in favor of God's vision for human relationships, to be those moral voices, and to be priests, in a sense, the priesthood of all believers, that when we're baptized, we're all baptized to be self-sacrificing in a way. And self-sacrifice is a difficult notion. Some people kind of operate with the notion of self-sacrifice, meaning that I kind of ignore my own needs to take care of other people's needs. But that's not a healthy model. And Pope Francis kind of reminds us that we take care of other people's needs because we see ourselves in them. And this is a very important point, that my needs are the same as another person. And I'm fundamentally the same person as this other person. So I may be working with someone who's elderly, and that person is suffering from loneliness, and I can recognize that I myself am a fundamentally lonely, finite, limited creature of God. And so it's kind of, it goes back to that prayer of the Pharisee from the scripture that I mentioned in the book at one point. The Pharisee who prays, "Thank God I am not like that other person." And I believe that's kind of the unhealthy sense of, you know, doing the work in the church to care for others. If I'm doing the work in the church and I'm helping out in some way as a public Catholic, or helping out in a social work situation, and I'm saying, okay, well, this person is needy, but I'm not. This person is the one who is always weak and vulnerable and in need of God's love. But I'm the one who does that. I'm the one who gives God's love. Then we kind of lose sense of the fact that, well, I'm a creature of God too, and I also need God's love, and I also suffer from a lot of the same things, you know, and I'm human. I'm not God. I'm not Jesus. And hopefully I'm humble enough in my ministry to see Jesus present as the third person in the room when I'm working with somebody, or to see Jesus in somebody's life, even if the person isn't noticing Jesus there, and to kind of give Christ the space to heal that person and be present to that person. Because if we put it all on our own shoulders, we're gonna stumble and fall, and we might end up resentful and burnt out, and we might leave the church. There are some people who work for the church and after several years kind of get frustrated and say, well, I'm doing everything and nobody else is, and then they leave. So that's a difficult issue, and like a lot of things, I don't have easy answers for it, and I don't believe Francis has easy answers for it. But one thing Francis says is, I think he even says this in Amoris Laetitia, his recent The Joy of Love post-synodal exhortation on love in the family. He says, you don't need the Pope to tell you everything. You don't need the magisterium to tell you what to think or feel or how to do everything. But, you know, we can kind of pray and discern and in the sense of subsidiarity, come to a sense of God's action in our lives on a personal level and have that personal relationship with Christ, and come to that sense on a parish level or in whatever group we're working with, that we're really in relationship with others. We're never doing it alone. So I appreciate that question. Thank you.
I do have one more question, and you may have touched on this somewhat, but to address it more directly, what tips do you have for increasing humility and accepting that you can't help everyone all the time?
That you can't tell everybody, you said?
Help everyone all the
Oh,
time.
can't help everybody. Well, just stepping back from things. You know, Jesus withdrew to the mountain to pray. So even Jesus Christ, who was God on earth, felt overwhelmed by the crowds when he was preaching. And even Jesus needed to go away to the mountain to pray. And when I was teaching high school, I would withdraw to my room sometimes to pray. And I would reflect on all the wonderful interactions I'd had that day and reflect on how God was present to people. But it was exhausting, and it made me recognize that I needed to take a break sometimes. And when we're so intensely involved with the situation, that kind of can wear us down. And we have to be aware of how that's wearing us down. And kind of the humility is basically seeing myself as God sees me and not as I see myself. So to be able to say, you know, Sean, you did some good things today. You made a few mistakes. That's okay. And maybe some situations are unfixable and you can't solve them. A lot of times as ministers and priests, we run into unfixable situations, whether it's in the confessional or in the classroom or in our parish. And we really badly want to control other people or say, I know how to fix that person. But sometimes we can't. Honestly, we can't. Not all of us are trained as professional social workers or psychiatrists or priests. And there's a certain humility in saying, you know, I can give this person what I have to give. And then if that doesn't work, just pray for that person and lift that person up to God. Yeah, so that's just some thoughts. I don't have a lot of answers, but I have some sort of thoughts on some of these things.
Well, that is great, very helpful, and it encouraged someone else to ask a question that's kind of the flip side of that. Could you speak to about those individuals who want to do everything and won't let others do things? How can the church grow in this situation? I find that there are many who would love to participate, however, due to the politics of the church, are not allowed.
Yeah, that's a really difficult situation, and in some ways we've learned a lot from Protestants in the last 50 years, because in the Catholic Church before Vatican II we didn't often use the word ministry, and now you see people who kind of have their own ministries, people like the apologist Gus Lloyd, who's part of Gus Lloyd Ministries, or this Hard as Nails Ministries, or these various organizations. And in the Protestant tradition, a lot of times when people don't get along, they kind of go off and start a separate group. In the Catholic tradition, we tend to say, well, we're going to stay together, and you know, even if we don't like each other. And there's something to be said for that. And in the Catholic tradition, a lot of times reform movements turn into religious orders like the Jesuits or Franciscans. But if it's just a very simple situation where you as an individual want to get involved in something and you feel like there's no opportunity for that at your parish, step out and do something on your own. You know, you don't always need formal church approval to do something. So if you feel like you're going to a parish that isn't doing enough for the poor, and that parish is, you know, very active in other ways, but that it's just a little bit removed from realities that you would like to see represented, maybe go out and start something, or find another group that's interested in that, or try to find like-minded people. And maybe it won't be an official group within the parish, but, you know, eventually things have a way of becoming part of the Catholic Church if people are dedicated enough to do them. And I had one other thought, but it's still kind of early in the morning. But you know, the other thing I would say is that, kind of losing it. Anyway, do you have another question, or should I?
No, I think that we will finish there and say thank you so much. I'm anxious now to finish the book. I've got part of it read, but anxious to finish it, and I'm sure lots of others are. Thank you so much, Sean.
Oh, you're welcome, Tracy, and thanks for having me.
You're so welcome. And I'm going to take the screen back from you now, and I'm going to mute you so you can carry on with your day. But everybody don't leave, because I still have some books to give away. So our names drawn at random are Sister Grace J, last name starts with a J, Vince F, last name starts with F, Colleen F, and Christine O, and Angel Luis, last name starts with an R. If you could please send me your mailing addresses, we can get a copy of the book, What Would Pope Francis Do, sent out to you. The rest of you, of course, if you're so moved, you can go to www.osv.com and order your copy. So thank you all for joining us. A couple of other things I want to tell you about. Just a reminder to get registered for our Sunday Visitors new e-newsletter, Simply Catholic. Go to osv.com/Simply Catholic, and you can find us on Facebook too. If you just search for Simply Catholic. This is a great free Catholic resource for you. You will get no more than one email a week from us. And thank you again to our presenter, Sean Salai SJ, and thanks to all of you for joining us for our Authors Series webinar today. We so much appreciate your time and your interest, and look forward to seeing you again next month to hear Karen Edmiston talking about her book, You Can Share the Faith. Remember to get registered. You go to osvoffertory.com/calendar and click on the date. I am once again quickly going to read the names of our winners of our books today. Sister Grace J, Vince F, Colleen F, Christine O, and Angel Luis R. If you just want to send me those addresses through the questions box, or you can email me directly. Congratulations. This concludes today's webinar. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. God bless.